What's up guys, welcome back to yet another video of Alfheim. It's pretty safe to say at this point that this week is gonna be a bit of a marathon of Alfheim, basically because this is by far my biggest priority at the moment. I do still have other things that I am planning, like the Bone Shaker POV, don't worry about that, that's definitely coming up. And just my regular city skylines and park tech things that I want to return to in the future as well. But at the moment I just move those into the background to be able to finish this thing before the 1st of July, which is when the deadline for the competition is. And I also have to say, finishing the coaster itself is a bigger priority for me at the moment than the making of this series, so I'm kind of lagging behind already, and that's why the rest of this week might become a bit of a marathon, because I am recording these time lapses at a ridiculous rate just because I'm trying to push this thing out there and actually working on it pretty hard. But I end up with not as much time to do the commentaries and render these videos and get them onto YouTube, and it's not as important, so I might end up deleting more footage than I have predicted beforehand, or having the order of the videos a bit messed up, like uploading the final video before I actually get all the time-lapses out. Though I definitely hope that is not going to be the case. Things like that might happen, so just in case, there might not be too great features of professionalism from my side this week, just because I'm trying to push this ride out, and that's basically the main thing I'm concerned with at the moment. Awkward voice crack. Though, to actually talk about what's happening in the video for a second, I'm working on the station, which is a pretty big thing, and probably something I wanted to start this video off with. And it's a pretty big thing for a few reasons. It's a big building. Yeah, it's gonna be the biggest building of the entire park, actually, at least in terms of footprint. It's a very good opportunity to get some scenery around this area, because it's pretty tight over here with the track and the transfer tracks, and just the coasters and paths all around this area, so having that station as a very heavy part of the scenery is gonna help with that in the future. But it's also kind of important because it's more or less the blueprint for what the scenery in the rest of this area is gonna look like, because basically I want to go for an Elven village kind of idea. And while at the moment I have built the castle as the single building in this park at the moment, it's not really a good representation of what the entire area is going to look like scenery wise, because the idea is that I have this castle sitting on a hill, but around that, on the smaller hills, there's just going to be this sprawling Elven village, which is going to be the scenery around the ride. And it's that sort of architecture which I'll be more or less getting the inspiration for with this station, which is going to be a very basic idea of what everything, in terms of how everything is going to look like, revolves around. And there are a couple of basic building ideas that you can see in this station that I want to keep in the rest of the village, which is going to be the roof shape in general. I want to go for some pretty regular roofs, actually. They're quite a bit like the roofs in Rivendell. The only difference is that the top part arches upward a little bit, just to give it, well, a bit of extra flair, I'd say. Make it a little bit less boring than just a straight roof. Though aside from that, they're very typical Rivendell-ish roofs, especially with the gables on the side. An important detail in these buildings is going to be the detail right underneath the roofs. So a lot of detail is going to sit in the gables on the sides, but also a bit actually on the top of the roof like this. And I'll try to make the trims around the roofs pretty fancy. And another really important building and very distinguishing feature of these buildings is going to be the arches that I want to have underneath the buildings. They're going to be pretty simple in terms of shape. They're all more or less going to have these types of roofs with these types of gables, but the biggest parts of them will probably be made up of the arches that I want to have in the buildings. I don't just have straight walls, but I kind of just want to make more open buildings with a lot of arches, and going for the kind of gothic arches, not the round arches, but the ones that really point upwards, with basically these pillar pieces, which work quite nicely for them. They're pretty small pieces, so you can shape the arches out of them pretty nicely. They also have this nice, very fancy texture on the side. It is gonna be a bit of an issue for my PC. Like, at this point in time I still had a decent frame rate in this park, but I don't really recommend using pieces in this way if you really want to preserve your computer. But I am really happy with how the general idea for the arches came out, so I'll basically be supporting all of the roofs with a lot of arches like this, with pillars between them. And that is more or less going to be the general style of this town, so you can already recognize quite a bit actually, of what the entire scenery is going to look like in this station. I actually wanted to make this gable over here as well, and this is something to talk about a bit maybe when it comes to the roofs of these buildings. A lot of the like Elven village looks that you very often see in books and films, etc. is very strange. It's like with curved roofs with all sorts of shapes that you don't normally see, and it's that kind of thing which I figured for a while I could go with over here, but in the end I figured it would just be easier to go with a more Rivendell style roof. Just go with a simple gable roof that is kind of recognizable, not too crazy and not too fantasy-like, and just make sure that I get the more interesting and unique details in other ways. And with the roof as well, I figured it would be nice to have these simple roofs, but actually be able to get some more strange and elvish roofs in other ways. So I wanted to go for these very round, upward pointing dormers, and with some strange looking elven towers, which you'll see later on in this video. So that's the kind of approach I wanted to take here, and why the roofs themselves are pretty simple in shape, but why I wanted to go with this kind of dormer. And I think that's kind of idea, that it's simple, but that it has like more strange and elvish like details to it, I think describes the entire building's style pretty neatly. Like if you just look at the general shapes of these buildings, it's going to be pretty simple. Most of them are just going to be rectangular, simple buildings with not too much weird things going on, not too much sticking out, not too weird and unusual composition kind of ideas. They're just gonna be straight buildings with simple roofs, but with the details bringing out the more fantasy aspects to them, and, you know, towers and dormers bringing out a bit more of the stranger and more unusual shapes in these buildings. And that kind of applies to this station as well. One of the biggest challenges that I felt for this station is the fact that it's on a square footprint. You might have heard, actually very understandably too, a very common tip which says that you want to avoid building buildings with a square footprint as much as you can, because it's just one of the easiest ways to end up with a really depthless, boring looking building, even if you add a lot of detail to it, because basically it's just going to end up looking like a box. It's not going to have anything to bring out the depth or make it more interesting to look at, and even if you add a lot of detail to it, it's just gonna look like a very detailed box, which doesn't make that great of a difference. And I would reckon it is more interesting actually to look at a building that has a really interesting composition and is engaging that way than just a square building with a lot of detail put onto it. And that's one of the reasons why I did feel this building was a bit challenging to get right, since it is on a square footprint. And one of the things that I really wanted to try and do here is to still make it look as interesting as I could, and as unsquare as I could, especially from this side here, even though it is on a square footprint in the end. And what I try to kind of do is have this smaller roof that kind of hangs over on the left side here, and have a higher roof but that doesn't hang over as much and is more toward the end of the building on the right side, and have that very flat kind of balcony looking part on the right side as well, to make sure that even though it's all built pretty much on a square, the roofs aren't following that square and are more offset in that sense, just to make it look less obvious that it is built on this square foundation. And it doesn't entirely work at the moment yet, but it's also going to work in the future with adding some rock work around this part, and maybe a few parts that kind of stick out from the building here and there, and foliage around it, to kind of mask the fact that it's just such a blocky building. If you look basically from right above the building, it's still going to look like a square, but I try to add things and remove things here and there to make sure that it doesn't look blocky if you look at it from the side. And that's basically why I wanted to build it in the way that I've done so at the moment. So I would say it's not that bad of a thing to build buildings in a square shape, especially in the cases where it's pretty much just legit to do so. Like if you're making a main street, or if you just want to have a pretty simple square building, in any case it's definitely far from a mistake. But in this case, since it is a fantasy theme and the station is pretty important to look at, and I wanted something more interesting than just one very simple thing. Not to mention that if I went for one roof following the exact shape of the building here, I would have had an absolutely enormous roof, so that's also another good reason why I wanted to use more different smaller roofs that kind of come into and out of each other here. But yeah, working with a square footprint isn't actually always that bad, but in a case like this, just by adding these different roofs in different directions and kind of parts that stick out in different ways, it can still work pretty well if you have a building on a square footprint. What I wanted to do over here is add a quick transfer track, which is pretty simple. Actually, it also doesn't technically work, and this is something I also want to address for a bit. I've gotten many comments about why I add these things around here, but basically, realistically, roller coasters have a transfer track, especially at this size. They don't always have transfer tracks, but the larger roller coasters always do, to be able to store their trains. So I wanted to have a transfer track right before the station for both of these coasters, but there wasn't a lot of space left. And the problem with the purple coaster here is that there's definitely a huge lack of space, and the way that a transfer track usually works is there's a part where it switches, where there's a track that can move over a rail to lead to another track which goes into a storage building. But over here I didn't really have space for a storage building or a storage rail, so the storage rail is on the transfer track itself. And realistically it would have to move 2 tracks to be able to transport one car to the transfer track, which is stored on the transfer track, which is really strange. So technically it's not very much a working thing, but I figured better have a kind of weird, unusual transfer track than nothing at all. So that's why I went with that. And I guess I could also repeat King RCT3's words, which are absolutely genius, and I'll use as a reply to everything from now on. This transfer track just uses Elven magic, and that's how it basically works. And that's how I'll try to refute every single criticism that I get. This coaster is gonna do a lot of unusual stuff, and even though I'm gonna try to basically make it as if it could be part of a real theme park, there are just some parts which are kind of impossible, and those are pretty much fixed with Elven magic, so that's something I'm not too worried about. And I also wanted to add a bit of rockwork over here. It's not too much, and most of the rockwork is something that I do want to do in like streams or just on my own instead of recording it, because this ride is going to have to feature a lot of it and it's not all that interesting to look at. It's mostly just more of the same basically. But I did want to feature a bit of rockwork here, especially since it is pretty important in dressing up the area around the station here. One of the things that the station is gonna kind of be like is this sort of hidden inside the forest kind of idea, and that's what a lot of this ride is gonna have, but the station in particular, because it really sits in this valley between the hills surrounding this area and the big hill where the castle sits on. So it's kind of gonna be hidden among trees and rockwork pretty much all around it. And you're never going to be able to see the entire station from any direction, and that's kind of the idea that I want to go for, like this sort of secret hidden elven house in the forest, which a lot of the general surrounding area is going to have, but the station more so, because I want to have some elven village parts in this park as well, and they're not going to be as densely foliaged, if that's a word, and they're going to be a bit more visible and prominent than the station, which really sits in this valley down here. And the foliage surrounding it is going to be a bit exaggerated as well, because even though I do want to make this a sort of general realistic coaster, and you do see roller coasters with quite dense foliage, especially Nemesis I think is a pretty cool idea of like dense foliage around a sort of rocky terrain with a terrain invert. I do want to make this a bit more dense and mixed up than you would realistically commonly see, especially around scenery like this, and also on the scale of these coasters, because they are really large coasters, and the foliage will be really dense and varied, so really a lot of flowers and bushes pretty much everywhere, which I wouldn't realistically say you should do because there's just too much, and in a real park there would have to be people to actually maintain all that, which is why flower beds far outside paths is a bad idea generally, but it's something I kind of want to ignore here. Just use the elven magic to care for all the plants here and just make the area a bit more fancy than I normally realistically would, because in the end it's a bit of a fantasy over here as well. Moving on to the last part of this video, this is kind of a fun part. I'm adding the final tower of the station, which is something that I only added after the rest of the station was done. I always had a bit of like an empty spot over here, and I never really knew what I wanted to do with it. And when the station, like the rest of the station was done, I was looking at it for a while and figured it doesn't work that well. It kind of lacked a real center point of attention. And I figured a nice way to get that and give it a nicer composition in general would be to add a tower beside it, and it also helps to bring a bit more elven magic into the station, because at this point it still kinda looks like a general alpine building, even if it has all of these elven-esque touches to it. And this tower is really gonna look very elvenish and not very much like anything in real life. Definitely has that elven kind of roof to it with a slight curve and slightly pointing toward the side, and then it'll have a spire in the middle of it, so really interesting and unusual roof shape. Which was also kind of a pain to build for a while, but I'm actually pretty happy with how it worked out. It's definitely something I want to keep trying a bit more with spires and dormers, just because it brings out the elven idea pretty well, without being too obnoxious and without being too out of this world and too strange of a shape to fit in with the somewhat alright normal looking buildings of this area in general. So it's the one fancy tower over here. It has a pretty narrow base when you compare it actually to the width of the tower roof itself. Just to make that roof and the top part of the tower come out a little bit more. I guess this could be a clock tower, but there's really no use for it. It's just a piece of scenery for the station to make it look a bit more interesting. And what I wanted to do with it over here, I was figuring for a while I could just have simple windows on the side of the building, but it just ended up not really working and not being something that I really like that much. Speaking of windows in towers, I'm still gonna get back to the windows in the towers of the castle. Because yeah, realistically, like many people said, there would be spiral staircases in those towers, and it would make no sense to have 4 windows on all 4 sides of the tower on the same height if the staircase inside of it is in a spiral shape, so I'll definitely get back to that. But in this tower I wanted to not have that many windows and go for a nice little pattern on the side instead, which adds a bit of elven magic to it as well, a bit of like fancy kind of rose drawing plant-ish idea to it, which turned out to not be that great to make, and actually forgot to make this into one building, so I had to end up making it again for the other sides. Anyway, I still have a few cinematic shots that I've got, so I'll show those and just leave you at that. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time.